for taxation in Latin America and the Caribbean, of which Chile is the temporary president, holds the temporary presidency and cooperation with the ICLAC. There is also Colombia and other countries that are working in tandem to create a supranational space to discuss international taxation and human rights. And in a few days, when we have the second negotiation round in the UN for a committee to serve fiscalization topics in a space in a more democratic space, in my opinion, which is the OECD, where other interests. We also have Luis Moreno, member of Latindad, Maria Emilia Mamberti, CESR, who also work in fiscal policy and human rights, and also a member from Eurodad. We're going to begin with Tove, who is going to tell us how this negotiation round looks like at the UN. And we hope for the second round that everything that is at stake and Tove didn't actually join us due to scheduling, but she left a video for us to see and then make some questions if you have them. And maybe between Luis, Maria Emilia, and I, we can answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for the invitation to send inputs to the webinar. My name is Tove Riding. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Tax Justice at the Eurodad. And I'm also one of the representatives of Europe in the coordination committee of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And in the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, I also, together with the Reggie from the Secretariat, I co-coordinate the working group on UN and tax, where we have meetings and discuss joint strategies and campaign and advocacy initiatives. And I've been asked to say a few things about the UN Tax Convention process, where it's coming from and where it's going. So the first thing to say on where this is coming from is that the issue of tax and the United Nations goes very far back. In fact, over 100 years ago, there was something called the League of Nations, which was the organization before the United Nations. And they were discussing international tax issues because already 100 years ago, it was very clear that it was difficult for one country's tax system to work effectively unless there was some way of working together between governments internationally. For example, when a company is working in several countries, there has to be some sort of clarification on where does that company pay tax, on what amount of income. And so that discussion started at the United Nations predecessor, the League of Nations. But then over 50 years ago, the OECD countries pushed very hard to have the issue of international tax moved from the United Nations to the OECD. And that's how it's been ever since, is that the OECD has been leading on global tax rules and standards. Now, there was a UN process started a bit over 20 years ago, known as the Financing for Development process. It started in Monterrey. And there, already over 20 years ago, there was a discussion about bringing tax into the United Nations again. There was a proposal to have an intergovernmental negotiation on tax. And it was discussed whether it should be a separate body or it should be within the United Nations. But the essence of the idea was that there should be a place where all countries are equal. And there was already then a concern from developing countries that when the OECD is leading on international tax rules, OECD countries will, of course, be more important than other countries. And so there was a concern that the OECD process wouldn't be fair. And already 20 years ago, the OECD countries said, no, we should keep international tax issues at the OECD. So on and off, civil society have also been engaged, and developing countries have continued to push for the idea of having the United Nations be the place where international tax issues are discussed. And as many of you might know, we've also had, as the Global Alliance, since the Global Alliance was founded a bit over 10 years ago, it's been a key issue for the Global Alliance to have a UN process on tax. And fast forward, we had it as a big issue in 2015 when there was a Financing for Development Summit in Addis. And there we didn't win the campaign. We lost again. The OECD countries once again insisted that international tax issues should be at the OECD. But we didn't give up. We continued the campaign, and it's been a key issue that has been pushed by colleagues all around the world. It's really been a uniting campaign under the Global Alliance for a long time. And finally, in 2022, so about 1.5 years ago, the Africa Group at the United Nations, they said, now is the time to have an intergovernmental UN tax process. So they tabled a proposal at the UN General Assembly in what's known as the Second Committee. And the proposal said that there should be an intergovernmental UN tax process. And of course, again, we all worked together to push for this. And to our surprise, the proposal was adopted by consensus. Suddenly, all countries agreed that there should be an intergovernmental UN tax process. But it wasn't clear what this new UN negotiation should be about. It was clear it was about tax, but what should come out of this new process, that was not clear. And then last year, in 2023, in October, the Africa Group came back, and there had been a proposal from the Secretary General of the United Nations. There had been a report about what the options were for what the UN could work on. And of course, the issue of a UN tax convention was an option in the Secretary General's report. So the Africa Group came back to the General Assembly and they said, we want a UN convention on tax. And there was a lot of debate, and in the end, the Africa Group proposed that it should be a framework convention on tax. Now, framework conventions is a type of convention where first you have a convention that has the basic objectives and principles and commitments, but then you have a stepwise approach where you can have more agreements later on, and then those next agreements are called protocols. And one example of a framework convention that many people know is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the Climate Convention is a framework convention, and as you know, it has, for example, the Kyoto Protocol and also the Paris Agreement as additional agreements later on. So the proposal from the Africa Group was to have a framework convention on tax. And once again, they put it to the General Assembly, and there was a vote in November last year. And what we saw in that vote was not only that the Africa Group, of course, it was their proposal, they supported to have a UN Convention on Tax, but there was actually 125 countries in the United Nations that voted yes. And the United Nations has 193 member states. So it was a very, very clear and strong majority. And it showed also that the support was coming from the developing countries. Within the UN, there's something called the Group of 77, which brings together over 130 developing countries. And within the G77, there were a few countries that abstained, that didn't vote, but the vast majority voted in support of the Africa Group's proposal. What the vote also showed was that there were divisions in other groups. There were 48 countries that voted no. And of course, this was first and foremost the Global North OECD countries. But even within that group, there were also splits. For example, in Europe, we had Norway and Iceland abstaining. They didn't vote. The European Union all came out. Every EU member state voted no. But we also saw, for example, among the OECD countries in Latin America, it was interesting to see that Colombia and Chile voted yes. And we had an OECD country like Mexico abstaining. So also there, we had splits among the OECD countries in Latin America as well. So what happened after the vote was that the resolution, the proposal was adopted, which means that now the negotiation has started. And the plan is now to have in 2024, between now and the end of August, they are supposed to finalize terms of reference for the UN Convention. So it's a first step. And then when the terms of reference are finalized, when there is a proposal, it's going back to the United Nations General Assembly, where the proposal will be to adopt the terms of reference and start the negotiation of a UN Convention on Tax. A few things about how it's going now. First, in February, they had a first session to decide how to negotiate. And what we saw there was that all countries in the United Nations, all the member states, also the ones that voted no to the proposal, they came back to the negotiating table. We had everyone in the room. We had United States, we had the EU, we had all the countries around the table. And they managed to reach a decision by consensus. They managed to all agree on a roadmap on how to move forward until the end of August to finalize the terms of reference. It was also decided that there would be 2 negotiating rounds looking at the substance. And the first negotiating round started in April and ended in May. So they had a negotiating round, which was the first time they really looked at what should be in the UN Convention terms of reference. And then the next negotiating round starts in July, at the end of July, and then it runs into August. And there we have 3 weeks of negotiations, which is a lot. So there's really time now to work very thoroughly on what should be in the terms of reference for the UN Convention on Tax. A few things on how the first negotiating round ended. The first thing to say is that once again, we had consensus. We had a full agreement on the roadmap ahead. So all countries are still involved and everyone is at the table and participating. And the second thing is that we now saw what kind of issues, what kind of tax issues are governments asking for in the UN Tax Convention. And there it was a positive surprise for us that all of the issues that we have been wanting to see, they all came up. Of course, we have proposed as civil society, we have proposed them to the negotiations, but governments also picked up these proposals. And some important examples is, of course, corporate tax and the digitalized economy. So a reform of the corporate tax system, stopping illicit financial flows. and really starting a more fundamental reform of the way we tax multinational corporations that came up. And developing countries were very clear on some important issues, including the way that the right to tax multinational corporations today, the way that is decided is in favor of the country where the headquarter is located of the corporation. And that's something the OECD has always been supporting. But that's not good for developing countries because they are the countries where there's a lot of economic activity, but they don't have many corporate headquarters in their countries. So developing countries were saying it's important to have a different way of splitting the right to tax multinational corporations and revising this. This was very important for us, so that was good. The next issue that came up very clearly was taxation of what's called high net worth individuals. Basically, issues of taxing wealthy people. That also came up very clearly. And on that, we also saw some European countries like Germany and Spain support that the UN should look at ways to tax very wealthy people. But this is also an issue where we see a lot of Latin American countries come in and play a positive role and ask for the UN to look at this issue. And as part of that, of course, we're also going to have to look at the ways in which wealthy people can hide wealth. So this is about hidden bank accounts in foreign countries. This is about automatic exchange of information to make sure that tax administrations get the information that they need to expose when wealthy individuals are trying to hide their money. And this came up as well. We currently have an OECD system for automatic information exchange. It's not working well at all for developing countries. And therefore, we need to review this system. And that also came up very clearly. Then we had the issue of tax and the environment. And then there's a lot of focus now on making sure that there is coherence between the UN's job of combating climate change and the UN's work on an international tax convention. And there it was very good to see that there were several countries bringing up the importance of starting to link environmental issues and the international tax negotiations. That's also very important for us. And then there's an issue about the broader links to sustainable development and making sure that the tax systems, both at the national level and internationally, help to reduce inequalities and achieve the sustainable development goals. And that was also an issue that came up quite clearly in the negotiations. At the same time, one thing that's extremely different with the UN negotiations compared to the OECD is that at the OECD, civil society is not allowed to be in the room. We're not even allowed to be in the building. The negotiating text is secret. We can't see what's being negotiated. We can't see what our governments are saying on our behalf. But in the UN negotiations, we get to be in the room. We get to make interventions. The negotiating texts are public, and we can send inputs to the process, and we can see what our governments are saying, both because we are in the room, but also because it's live streamed on the internet. So we actually now have the whole first negotiating session can be watched online. The videos are on the internet. And that creates a whole different political opportunity to influence these processes, both by being at the negotiations. They are in New York at the UN headquarters, but also by following up in national capitals and making sure that the governments know that we are following their statements and make sure that they know what we would like them to do in the negotiations and then follow up. regardless of whether they said something good or said something bad, it's very important that they feel that the organizations at the national level are following the negotiations and asking governments to be ambitious and push for a UN tax convention that really becomes both ambitious and effective and fair. It's a lot more work for us now that we can participate in the negotiations, but it's also an extremely important opportunity. And the next steps now, so at the first negotiating round, the job was not to agree on everything. It was just the first round to see what people wanted. And now the negotiations are going to the second round, and there they're going to have to start reaching agreements on what should the terms of reference look like for the UN Convention. Again, they don't have to solve everything now, but they have to agree on what goes in the terms of reference and what does not. So that's why the next negotiating round is going to be extremely important. And it's going to be very intense. It's these 3 weeks of negotiations from July to August. And of course, as usual, we will be coordinating civil society inputs and preparing ourselves, but we're also very, very keen on those who can and want to consider to come to New York and join us and be part of the negotiations. And at the same time, we're also very keen to support the work at the national level to make sure that everyone has what they need to engage in the negotiations. And we're really trying to help in every way we can. And one of the things we've done, for example, is to produce Q&A documents to explain what's going on and to share information and work together to try and make sure that everyone knows what's going on. And then also coordinate inputs to the negotiating text and make sure that we have position papers as a civil society. Now, the last thing I want to touch on is what issues are looking difficult in the negotiations. And the first thing to say about that is that, of course, we had 48 countries that voted no to having a UN convention. And now they are back at the table and they are participating in the negotiations. But it's also very clear that there are some of them that still don't like the idea of having a UN convention on tax. We have the United States, for example, but also a country like Canada also really don't look very happy about the idea. Inside the European Union, it seems that we have now a split. The EU doesn't have much positions. They only have a very, very short position as the EU. And then the EU member states are negotiating individually, and that's quite unusual. But on this issue, they really started to negotiate separately. And they also don't all seem to have the same position. So it's quite interesting to see how the EU position is diversifying. And that can be very important going forward, because one of the things that we're hoping to see is that we will have an alliance of progressive countries, that we have the countries that are not tax havens and are generally losing out because of illicit financial flows and can see the need to have more and better global tax rules, that they can find each other and work together going forward so that we get a big group of countries that are moving ahead. And then if a few countries like the United States and Canada and maybe some of the tax havens, if they want to not cooperate and not be part, that's not such a big problem as long as we have a big group of countries moving forward. And there, of course, the Latin American region is also extremely important, and that's not my area of expertise, but I can say that we have seen in the negotiations that the Latin American governments are starting to be quite active. And we both have the Latin American countries that are either already OECD members or trying to become OECD members, like Peru. And it's clear that they have a bit one foot in each camp. And sometimes they support the OECD, sometimes they support having a UN convention and working with developing countries. They've been leaning more towards developing countries in the latest negotiations. Before they were sometimes they were outright trying to stop the process, but now they're starting to engage more. But there is an important issue in making sure that they continue to really side with developing countries, and that they also realize that they also can benefit from having a UN convention on tax. And then, of course, we have other countries, such as Cuba, that plays a very different role, and is generally more progressive, and more aligned with the developing countries. And there's also a country like Brazil. It's very clear that Brazil has currently is leading the G20 and is very focused on the G20 process. But one thing we're hoping is also that Brazil starts engaging with the perspective of getting a tax system that also works for developing countries. Brazil has had this position in the past, so it's something we're hoping to see, that they really come in and play a constructive role, instead of being very focused on G20 as they are at the moment. So these are some of the issues that we'll be keeping an eye on going forward. And we have these regular conference calls. We have about one call a month, and the civil society organizations are all very welcome to join. And that's where we work together on feeding in to the negotiations and discussing the different issues that come up. And what we expect is, so by the end of August, we will have a final result of the process. It might be that we have an outcome where we have a draft terms of reference that most countries have said okay to, but not all. It might also be that we have a clear split again, where a big group of OECD countries don't want to be part. We'll have to see how it goes. But one thing that's been extremely important in this process is really to have both the Africa group, but also the broader group of developing countries leading. They are really the reason why we have come as far as we have. And so it's very important to have countries in the global south that continue to push forward, both in July and August in the negotiations, but then also in October and November, when we're going back to the UN General Assembly, and where we will need the mandate to start the real negotiations on the UN Tax Convention. So campaigning at the national level would be extremely important to make sure that the governments are really engaging constructively. And what they're talking about at the moment is to start the negotiations. So that would be in early 2025, start the negotiations of the UN Convention. And then they are, at the moment, they're talking about trying to finalize the Framework Convention within 1 year to 1.5 years. So we're really talking about a fast-moving process, and so far we've been extremely positively surprised about how well it's gone. So we're extremely excited about this momentum and everything that's happening at the moment, and we're very keen to work with everybody to get a global civil society push to continue the progress that we've seen so far. Thank you again for the invitation, and I hope this was helpful.
We thank Tove for this video once again. So I think we are facing a paradigm shift. We can analyze the aspects that led to it, but the leadership of the global south is important in the shift. This is a long-standing and long-going event, and that to having 125 out of 193 countries is it's impressive, particularly with the inclusion the inclusion of digital economy, corporate tax, illicit funds, and taxing wealth. And something relevant that she also said was that the immediate exchange of information doesn't work as it should. We need to have that in mind because this is one of the main battlefields. Because just signing that thing that just signing agreements for to share information solves issues, and it doesn't. She also mentioned that Latin America is key for all of this. She mentioned the countries that are leading the front and those that are joining. And I want to invite Luis Moreno, who is a member of Latindad. He's covered some of the international taxation subjects within Latindad, and to ask why is Latin America so important in this scenario, and what is going to happen with PITLAC and the tax platform, so that you can tell us a little bit about it. Hi, Adrienne. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation to participate about what is happening with international taxation, and more specifically about the subjects that we're covering, which is the creation of a tax convention within the UN. So I told you a lot of what I was going to cover, so that makes my work a little easier. And so I'm just going to underscore what she said and I also have a second presentation to analyze in a different way a historical recount of recent events that have occurred and have led to the occurrence of this process and the work of the UN. And I also want to cover the work that we have done with civil society and social groups to bring this work forward at the international level. Uh, there we go. Yes. You can see my screen. Yes, we can. So this is a timeline. So it's basically a summary of what has happened with with the process in the last few years, which is what I want to share. From more recent actions in the last 20 years. As Tove specified, that this taxation process has been on the side of the UN since the beginning of the last century. It's been a constant work within the UN to recover income, make the taxation system work for everyone. So just a brief summary of the processes. Some of them, not all of them, of course. Some of the most important milestones that have marked our work through this process. One of them was the, the first financing development conference in Monterrey, Mexico, where the Cedillo report came from. This report covered how to structure an international process on the topic of taxation. Some background. We have the panel of the Forum for Financing Development in 2002. It creates the International Taxation Organism. Financing for development, this process, as we see in this report, is that mobilization of domestic resources, human rights, gender equality, climate protection were key in order to cover what were the development goals at the time, mobilizing domestic resources. And this panel, in its discussion, incorporated that mobilization, taking some observations that it could make, like such as illusion and evasion of taxes at the time, with some transitional economies that were having issues to fund public spending. Then the beginning of globalization that also presented its own challenges for the egalitarian recollection of taxes. In addition, Globalization creates doubts or disputes regarding tax collection, and they emphasize that the competition towards zero or downstream or and, and as well also creating incentives to bring other countries to invest. But from that time, this already created issues due to the loss of resources that it implied. So there was a call to strengthen international cooperation in taxation issues, focusing in developing countries, which were the ones losing the most. So the Cenillo report's proposal, which came before the report issued by the countries regarding development financing, there was a proposal in 2021, just to have an international taxation organ, which was an expert panel of independent experts summoned by the Secretary General of the UN, Kofi Annan, for that time, and presided by Ernesto Zedillo, the former president of Mexico, or that is why the report bears his name. And the one of the requests or one of the things included to exchange information and the creation of an international taxation organization. From the beginning and within the framework of the UN, and it was a calling as well to mobilize efforts. So in the end, this proposal was delivered to the preparatory committee, but it was not approved. But it was expected to be implemented in the near future. So based from this time on, we began working from civil society organizations throughout the years to mobilize efforts for a regional and global agenda for tax justice. One of the many objectives that we had was to break the control of transnational power in global governance of taxation. So we had to act against a regional articulation against tax abuses and secretism and great and large wealth. There was work to be done there. This is more around the beginnings of the 2010s. We also needed to see the role of the G20 and the OECD in the articulation of international rules, which in time were created at the BEPS, an articulation program at the global level, but that haven't been able to change the taxation system in the world and has led to losses in developing countries. And these measures were created or set up by developed countries, as Tove mentioned, where there wasn't a fair participation of all countries, but many of the rules that were imposed actually benefit mostly developed countries in an unequal way to what developing countries can get. So there was already we also had to strengthen the role of the G77 and the regional and global taxing cooperation to create a regional space in the case of Latin America, but also the creation of an intergovernment taxing convention at the UN. These are some of the most important access for the civil society. So from there was a multi-actor, multi-stakeholder work. So social mobilization was key. The indigenous women, youth, and unions to see the intersections that taxation policies touch, such as taxation justice and gender, human rights, education, the change of global taxation rules, the end of tax haven, the end of extraction industries, all within the framework of social mobilization that we kept during the last decade and which has been sustained through the several campaigns that we have held. Within that framework, we never lost sight of this process, of the Finance Development Summit for the third summit. And this we had where there was a large incidents and mobilization campaign with governments, with civil society, with the media, and so on, in order to reestablish the initial idea that we had at the beginning of the decade of the 2000 with the CDU report, having an international taxation organ within the UN that is truly inclusive and that truly considers the concerns of developing countries. So we could see that there were still obsolete rules within the taxation system. And the first goal was to try is is to create equality in this environment, and that for all of us in developing countries participate in the writing of these international rules. This did not occur due to the blockade of the great powers, which was considerable during this summit in 2015. However, we also set up the subject into the public agenda. So in the agenda, we could recover or include several commitments from the countries as part of the summit. There we highlight that international taxation collaboration need to have a universal reach and consider the needs and capacities of each country, particularly those that are not as developed. And there we have also carried out to cover resolve the taxation problems, but within that time, we have also faced some several processes that have been implemented. So as those within the OECD, so that we can have international taxation rules that are effective. However, the results of these processes have not been sufficient to truly resolve the issues of facing developing countries. Illicit funds flows and those related the abuses by fiscal abuses by corporations and large wealths. And having these international rules, they haven't really corrected the issue of illicit funds flow from those tax havens. Those tax havens are still owned, so to speak, of or dependence either owned by or directed by large powers. So we also see an issue, which was that large powers created the international rules when they themselves benefited from them, while also establishing the opacity of the taxation system at the international level. So then in 2017, there was also an important work to put this forth again in the agenda on the subject. And in Latin, Ecuador takes the presidency of the G77 and reignites this movement within the UN. From there, this debate starts gaining traction again, and now there is a new opportunity. And now some recent events in the 2011, the high-level group on Africa, on the Mbeki panel, by the group of African countries, this panel begins working to quantify the loss of taxation flows from illicit funds flow and to conceptualize what those entail. That provides a great contribution to the international debate, and there's a large impulse to move the debate at the international level. In 2019, the African group of 54 countries presented for the first time in the UN, calling to develop a tax convention at the UN, which is what Toby told us about. There's some initiatives such as the high-level panel of responsibility, transparency, and financial integrity internationally to achieve the 2030 agenda to create to achieve economic consensus and make proper economic changes to stop illegal funds flow and some transparency measures such as restrictions on financial beneficiaries, encourage automatic exchange of information. All of this work was carried out in Africa. And then we have decisions in May 2022. They called the UN to start negotiations under it. And this is then it continues in September 2022, where the UN Secretary General announced his willingness to support the UN Convention on Taxing and to review world world taxing laws. This is a brief process that was started by the African Union. Then in 2023, there's the approbation of the tax convention by the initiative of the African Union, and they called for the creation of an intergovernment committee to prepare a framework convention on international tax cooperation. Uh, came as a surprise for all of us that had that had seen so many blockades in previous moments. So now there was a calling by Perez, who said that the tax concession can help in development. The civil society voices start working in some proposals on how to structure a framework convention on the UN. South Center, Eurodad, and the Global Alliance were, are working in with to bring this forth to the UN, but also some other civil society groups in order to promote several debates and exchanges and proposals about how the implementation of the taxation convention should be, as well as which substantive elements should be included into the agenda, and how it should work at the global level. So started from there, there was an important work, and also within the framework of the international agenda and in the regional debate, there's been key moments to create regional taxation spaces. One of the is the taxation platform of Latin America and the Caribbean, PTLAC, and a space supported by the Colombian government, which in 2023 was created with large participation by civil society organizations that also reconfigures or proposes measures on how to establish this space for taxation within the Latin American platform. It comes as a center for discussion of taxation issues. There is a temporary presidency held by Chile currently. Colombia was secretary up to before. It has two consultancy councils and a secretary held by ICLAC. And there are three thematic axes: progressiveness, tax expense, and environmental taxes. There are some drafts that have been presented to the countries that serve as references for countries when presenting any kind of regulation. And then some transversal axes, such as the minimal taxing and how it could affect Latin American countries. But there is also an approach to tackling the UN Tax Convention that hasn't really been developed by the different each country's political postures, but which could be very important when creating the norms and when trying to create a unified voice within the UN convention, which is a challenge. Particular something marking PITLAC's work is that it is non-binding, meaning that its proposals or decisions are not bound, or they do not bind every country to take them. Each country can take whichever posture is more which is better for themselves and the different tax policies that they want to encourage. However, there has been a large process of the OECD in the region. We have five countries currently, and we expect the addition of three more. We have also seen the participation of several countries of the different global forums of the OECD and for training work regarding with the BEPS inclusion framework, which has been important for countries. But as I said, I think, or I believe, there's a task to cover, which is that making that these that these processes lead to equal condition collection. There's another, there's the Punta del Este declaration process, where there was a commitment to implement the information of taxation information to tackle tax evasion, corruption, and other financial crimes, which is currently has a participation of 14 countries. The last report says that there was about 272 billion dollars collected in Latin America due to the measures implemented by information exchange. There's still a lot of work to do, and lots of work to do in the region, because the countries that can actually participate and recover those resources are very few. There are three countries which are the largest. There are some country groups that are advancing in this task, but there are some other countries that are still unable to fully integrate into these processes. So, what's happening now? What regarding the UN process? How is the Bureau and the ad hoc committee comprised? These bodies, and as Toby said, they are in charge of the drafting of the framework convention. There was an initial proposal regarding references at the beginning of June, which was taken by the committee, and which, with all the recommendations set out by the civil society and the government, a new document was prepared or drafted, which we're going to review, but also within this bureau, we have the representation of 20 representatives, four per each continent, one president, 18 vice presidents, and one rapporteur. And for Latin America, we had three countries because uh, when this proposal, because Latin America included one or two countries when the proposal to include four was made, so that it would rotate within the first period of the first session, where we had Brazil, Mexico, Bahamas, and Colombia. And for this second session, there was a change. We see a recomposition where we have Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, and the Dominican Republic or Jamaica will adhere to this process within the direction and the route. This process saw three marked stages. The decision rules of the ad hoc committee to prepare the reference terms, the, the decision rules for the negotiation of the convention, which is ongoing, and, which I mentioned, and a work that we expect will last throughout the end of the year, which should approve the reference terms for the convention, and the decision rules of the framework convention itself, which is these are the stages that are going to be carried forward. The duration time of the convention is estimated at 18 months to 2 years, and it will depend on the time of the second round. The proposal is to have it be between 2025 and 2026. There are some considerations that started to be taken into account, whether to have early protocols or initial protocols or not. If so, should they be over before the convention, the convention term? The initial protocol that is also part of this is included within the draft presented by the directors by the table. That's going to be with the subject of majority or consensus by the OECD. And then we also had the idea of having our substantive demands for the conventions and structure, and the thematic axis that should be included after. And now to conclude and to tell you how the current state, we have the reviewed reference terms to be discussed during the second session. We are over time. Just to wrap up, what we need to cover in this second phase, this second negotiation, we will discuss what the directors presented this week, actually. First, there was no unanimity in the contents of the document and its preparation. It is not really support. It is supported by all, but it's among its conversion is that it should include a principles declaration to establish tax cooperation, uh, a government governance, international taxation cooperation governance that can face those fiscal challenges. There are some principles that's, that says that the convention should also have a clear declaration on principles. Within that framework, the goals should have a goal. Each member state should have the sovereign right to decide on their policies and practices and to guarantee that they do not undermine the efficacy of the base or the tax base or system of other members, and to be included in the human rights discussions that Maria Emilia will delve deeper, as well as other principles that have also been framed within this process. There are some substantive elements that have been added, the allocation of imposing of multinational companies, the effective taxation of peoples with large wealth, strengthening, enforcing ability, capacities to take into account the capacities, priorities, and needs of each countries to significantly contribute to establishing good regulation. We also have structural elements and priority areas such as protocols and verification. There's There are some priority areas that need to include in these protocols in the early protocol. The taxation of digital economy, the taxation of income due to service or international income, and it excludes some issues such as environmental, gender, mutual mutual exchange of information, and all that could be covered in the next protocol. But this is all within the proposal. It's not necessary to. We need to encourage this debate and move it forward. And lastly, what do we need? We need urgent reform to end inequalities in global taxation rules, and so we need political support by the governments of the world, particularly in the global south. And so for that, mobilization is great need. We also have to need the support by the organized civil society for mobilization. We need to support our global agenda against illegal funds flow, the tax abuse of large corporations and wealth, equality of conditions within the framework of decision making, and linking global governance with key obligations such as rights, reducing inequalities, gender progressiveness, taxing the wealth, like transparency regulation, final beneficiaries, registries, all within all within the public facing uh, sphere. And so we need to move in advancing financing the development goals to move more toward a true taxation corporation. This ends the presentation, and thank you for the time. And I'm sorry it went a little over time. Thank you, Lucho. A really complete presentation, and it really responds to this shift in paradigm that were discussing. Obviously, there was some work that we have already done very deeply in proposing permanent changes. So now we have a tax platform in Latin America and the Caribbean, and to fight within the UN, as Tove and you said, to create a leadership that is stronger and more marked. However, as Tove mentioned in her presentation, involving other focuses and approaches and subjects such as the climate issue about us, from our human rights approach to taxation, we also focus on human rights, which has been in the terms of reference. But Maria Emilia is now going to tell us a little about how we are working on that approach, what we expect with the human rights agenda in the UN, and what are the challenges that of this accelerating agenda. Maria Emilia. Thank you, Adrian and Tove. And as you have seen, this entire taxation agenda has moved along very well, and it has some great results in the last years. And now, what I would like to set up as a stepping stone is this paradigm shift, using the example of human rights as a guiding, but it has some implications that are not just about international taxation, but about a questioning a broader questioning of multilateralism. It cannot be led by organizations that, by its own missions or opposition, ignore some of the problems related to their work agendas. And the subject of taxation and human rights is very clear. There are some organizations that are oriented toward thinking of rights as of large taxpayers and not about every person universally, and that affects how the state collect and assign public resources. Luckily, I think we are at the early stages, but very important stages, as Lucho just mentioned. And now we see this not only in the alignment, in the worry that there is explicitly and implicitly about human rights in the fora that we discussed today, but also in following up in a more routine and systematic way of human rights regarding tax. I believe it's like two sides of the same coin in civil society, which we have joined in for years. And this is a product of that union, but we're going to delve deeper. Under regarding human rights in Latin America, we see it very clearly in the strategic plan for the rapporteurship of social, economic, and cultural rights, which is one of the main axes, is economic and tax policies, which is not something that we could have expected a few years ago, but nowadays the social economic rights agenda is broadly transversed by taxation and taxation issues. We also see with public declarations by many special movements before the UN and regarding the preparation meetings that were held in Colombia last year before the launch of PITLAC, or welcoming the advances to move the discussions on international taxation from the OECD to the UN. So human rights mechanisms are also participating and seeing the existence and the abundance of standards that currently exist, the importance of some institutions regarding public finance. Actually, the summary, the abundance of these effects on human rights are based on human rights effects in tax policy that we launched. This is a work that has been a lot of years in the making, and now we're seeing the results in a very palpable way on how taxation mechanisms interpret their rules. I'm going to show a few examples for PIPLAC and for the process of the UN Convention, because it's what we have been discussing the most, and the purpose of this webinar, and what we're going to reference is the taxation agenda supported by Brazil by to achieve a minimal taxation of billionaires would also be an image sign of this paradigm shift toward a more rights-based approach. In the case of PITLAC, something that we achieved the last year after a very well coordinated work from civil society was the launch of the platform. The ministries of treasury that participated could identify the achievement of human rights as one of the final goals of tax policies. some of the people who are here might seem intuitive or logical, but that is a large, very important shift in the technical discussions. Speaking about rights during these kinds of meetings is key and could make a really important change in taxation policies. In the Cartagena summit, we said basically after reviewing the Ministry of Colombia, which was held the temporary presidency of the platform, showed that that was one of the consensus. And when we the participants saw the participation by the finance ministries, we saw a common and repetitive repetition of the importance of connecting human rights with taxing. Those are the explicit terms. Also, in explicit terms, within the UN process, in the last year, we saw the different steps, as Lucia mentioned, we saw uh, a gigantic leap in the strength and advances of the agenda. The international organizations are part of this initiative, and others that the Global Alliance coordinates globally. We saw some spaces and opportunities to participate in writing, noting the importance of terms of reference of the convention, including a calling to fulfill human rights and to align taxation efforts with human rights, as well as a concrete application of on which principles that alignment with human rights should result in, regarding on the cooperation by states to achieve human rights, to how to fully maximize their resources to achieve rights, and as well as equality and non-discrimination. We also spoke about this in terms of some of the procedural guarantees within the framework of human rights, such as participation and transparency. We started making these reviews and mapping, which is what we did at CESR, and how the measures of some other organizations and governments were insisting on the importance of connecting human rights with taxation. And this showed the importance of moving the taxation debate to the UN, because one of the pillars of the creation of this organization is promoting and protecting human rights. So it is natural that this platform was created to fulfill this mandate, to have the two faces of the coin need to be fully interconnected. When the initial draft came out, which is the zero draft of the reference terms of the convention, the result we saw with an echo with the written submissions that we saw in our organizations, we saw that the echo was partial, because it implicitly included human rights about and taxation and cooperation internationally with social and economic policies and development policies, that everything related included in the initial draft. However, the only explicit reference to human rights was, in a way, contrary to our vision, and human rights was seen as a limitation and less as a way to energize states. Why did this happen? Because in the initial draft, it referred to the privacy right as a limitation to transparency in taxation, which could affect taxation policy making. So including human rights again in the terms of reference. The human rights were included as the rights of large taxpayers, not as a limitation. This first draft created a new wave of written revisions where we saw how even the UN did a fantastic work by the High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights, but as well as civil society organizations, and we saw strong leadership by Chile, as well as a state organization that raised the point of the need of incorporating human rights as a general principle, general guiding principle in the next convention. And here we can see how efforts connect to reimagine taxation to make it to make it fairer and align with people at the regional level and the international level, with many countries leading the charge with human rights. In this case, explicitly mentioning rights as a guiding principle or at the preamble of the convention. All of those reviews had a large impact because those references, as Lucius showed, there aren't many significant changes, but there are important changes in human rights because it eliminates the reference of the right to privacy of taxpayers that could limit state transparency because in exchange it incorporates a general principle a guarantee of human rights, the effective performance of human rights in all countries and for every person. As it's drafted currently, it's one of the main objectives that it has. This might this might seem a little minimalist. I think it's one of the greatest landmarks in our struggle toward taxation fairness. It is unprecedented to have anything of the sort, such a strong bet on incorporating human rights as an interpretation and guiding principle in a convention such as this one. So there we have a task for organizations to join efforts to maintain that the principles of that text as it exists. Because as Lucio said, even though it's not a subject that I have to cover, based on previous experiences and submissions by states, that there's still a lot to discuss regarding procedural and agreement issues, so such as the scope of the term, the steps to be taken regarding timings and the convention, whether the existence or lack of protocol, and or more procedural topics as well. We also see that there's an alignment of many northern countries to adapt terms of reference that are less ambitious. There's an initial task of maintaining an explicit reference to human rights in the text as is. Then we also see some additions that are very, very innovative and that align with the human rights framework. And I'm going to choose just two examples seen by the LAC and in the reference terms of the UN to aid this idea that they are not isolated ideas, but concurrent processes within the framework of a questioning of multilateralism. We are imagining what the objectives or priorities of taxation should be. The two topics on which there is agreement is the connection between taxation policy and the climate agenda, and progressive and taxation progressiveness, as well as equality and the possibility of international contribution of people with large wealth, of the super or ultra rich. One of the three groups work groups BITLAC is climate and taxation. We are discussing millions of proposals, and we see this reflected as a new priority that did not exist before in the OECD or in the terms of reference of the UN Convention about Climate. We can discuss if it should be moved up in priority, but this is a very strong topic and which was repeated in the submissions made. The other subject is equality. To understand that there is a great potential of using taxation systems and taxation itself, not only domestically, but also internationally, to fight socioeconomic inequality. The non-discrimination principle is held at its core. And of course, the subject of economic inequality, which is what some of what these uh, Proposals could fight and other intersections, such as gender or race inequality, which human rights attempt to fight with specific instruments. So in PETLAC, there is a specific progressiveness group that has analyzed shared experiences and has run common diagnosis in the region, which is one of the most important subjects in the region regarding the incredible wealth that there is in Latin America. At the UN level, we also see the inclusion of taxation, uh, uh, large wealth persons. There are opportunities to include progressiveness, equity, and equality as other principles. Of course, these are initial efforts intended to reimagine taxation, and there is a lot more to go in depth. However, the fact that these spaces recognize the importance of human rights, conditions of equality, and also incorporate demands that not only the human rights movements but other allies, such as the feminist movement, have pushed forward and to have pushed for their inclusion is also a powerful thing. I'm going to take the example of the feminist group to mention where I see a large gap and need to continue gathering forces so that these initial commitments are achieved. And this is gender equality. In TLAC, when we made our recommendations for the civil society, we included this matter explicitly. And though we tried to make it transversal in the platform, it is not a work, it's not an explicit priority of the work groups. And this has been aggravated by the low representation of women, all of their diversity in the platform itself. There's still a deficit of participation in those spaces, which in a way make the topic worse, and not having it discussed explicitly. The same happens in the terms of reference. Even though some of the submissions by NGOs and intergovernmental organizations, we still see a large gap to the in the terms of reference, and we have found no state that is actually leading the charge, which really undercut the possibility of to have the topic to enter into become a central commitment, even though we can derive it from a more principle-based idea of human rights. So I think that one of the common tasks that we need to cover for the next stages and steps, both for PETELAC, ITLAC, and the construction of the terms of reference of the UN Convention, and eventually of this convention, is to make a calling to have all the great advances that the feminist movement did regarding taxation and gender equality in the last few years to be fully reflected in these initial steps and commitments in order so as to reflect them in taxation. I know that we have very few minutes in the webinar. There's a space for questions, so I'm going to leave it there so that we can discuss a little more. Thank you, Maria Emilia. Very interesting. I think that the rights perspective is really important for this international discussion, which has never been seen before, because some countries now have awakened, and that's a good question, a good thing. As Maria Emilia was saying, with the flag, we have seen that very clearly, and that is the central branch to fight inequality. I joined this next few steps, such as the steps taken by the feminist groups and the implication of the international taxation, because that's the point. We always say it, and we will do it again. We'll do it forever. It's not a technical issue, but it is an essentially political topic. So I want to join Maria Emilia's calling. We have very little time. While you think any questions you may have, we have none in the chat so far, I'm going to make three recommendations. One is that you can see this webinar again through LTB info at YouTube. We are going to upload it there, and it's going to be hosted at that address. Second is that tomorrow at 12 p.m. Buenos Aires, we're going to have another event, another webinar within the framework of this fourth week for tax justice and human rights and South-South cooperation and taxation issues, which has been discussed a lot throughout the track. We're going to speak about from compare perspectives between Latin America and Africa. As I said, tomorrow, 12 p.m. Buenos Aires, South-South cooperation for taxation purposes. Compare perspectives by Latin America and Africa. And third, I want to compel you to enter the initiative's website, derechosiniciativafiscal.org, so you can see the documents that we have drafted in the last few years and to see our main document, so that you can start analyzing taxation from that place. We have 6 minutes to go. I'm not sure if nobody has any questions. I would like to thank both Lucho, Marilina, and Tove as well, who didn't join us, but sent a video. I did want to ask about a minute and a half or 2 minutes, both Lucho and Maria Emilia, to answer something very briefly and almost personally. What are your expectations regarding the UN Tax Convention? And what do you think should happen, even one, so that we could say, well, we're on the right path? I think I know what Maria Emilia is going to say, but I'm going to let her say it, okay? Because I'm clear mention of human rights. But what else would each of you be happy with if it happened? We would make it worth it to go to New York and participate in the negotiations. Whoever wants to start, Lucho, maybe? Yeah, Lucho, you go first. Have a minute, a minute and a half, a little less than that. As I already told you, this negotiations round is extremely important so that we can position all the work that we have done in the last few years. I think that by having the possibility to hold this convention is important in and on itself. Now we have to include the substantive issues, such as the taxation movement that we have fought for in all this time, the thematic axis of incorporating relevant subjects, such as the need of having a space of taxation cooperation in equal conditions, which was one of the most important demands. The process is not done. We have plenty to discuss. Although we're going to have, in terms of reference, we have a 2-year process to go. So this is going to be a continuous fight. What I would hope is that we are not blockaded by the large powers, so that we can remove the substantive elements that we have presented throughout this time. So that could be an important step, so that we could have this work in conditions of equality, and for taxes to help our countries to recover a large amount of resources that we are losing due to the tax illusion, evasion, and illegal funds flow that finance public policies to achieve rights and human rights, as Maria Emilia mentioned, as well as universal social protection, the financing for the productive development, and to ensure that all of these demands are included within the UN Convention. Thank you. Thank you, Lucha. Maria Emilia. We find a balance between my ambitions and reality. because I don't get disappointed when I get to New York. And I think an important task would be to not allow some issues that repeat in conventions, consider a level repeat, and for them not to ruin our winnings in substantive issues. There may be references, but if the representations from some of the northern countries manage to block consensus, alter the decision-making rules, limit participation, extend negotiation terms, or change the language to make it too nuanced or involuntary, I think we're going to lose the opportunity to close on at minimum the content. I would like to have a procedural plan where all of these subjects, which are not as sexy, so to speak, we don't really follow them from society because we're looking at our substantive agendas. We can fall into a trap, and we see some of the typical topics of no duplication of conventions. I would be very happy if first southern states and organizations manage to jump over that trap to lower the preferences and not just making it the document a guide. And second, I think it's important not only to change text, but also changing minds and hearts and managing to sustain the participation from civil society as much as we can, continue meeting, have inputs, share information, build our own capacities mutually, find our meeting points in our agendas because we need to strengthen these spaces and we need to change people's minds so that these efforts are sustainable in the future. So not to fall in procedural straps and advance. So thank you very much, Luis, Marianilia, and the over 40 people who joined us today. As I told you, you can see this webinar from our website. And again, you're invited at 12 p.m. Argentina to see this South-South cooperation between Latin America and Africa. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for coming and participating. Thank you.